My surname, or family name, is Kiefhaber. We spell it K-E-F-O-V-E-R. There aren't many of us, maybe fewer than 300 souls. We live in the U.S., clustered in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Iowa, and Kansas. There are also a few of us in Colorado, Texas, California, and a few other places. But there are several other ways of spelling this name, ways that might make you think there are all these different families that don't and never did have any connection to each other. Once you understand how all those spelling variations came about and why they all represent the same name, you realize that there are probably 1,000 or more of us around the world. Okay, it's not like we're keeping up with the Joneses or Smiths, but the point is, there are considerably more of us with a shared ancestry than you probably ever imagined. So if you think your surname looks or sounds even a little like mine, you might want to stick around because I'm going to go deep in the weeds about Kiefhabers and the like. Actually, what I really want to do here is bring together bits and pieces of information from various sources, individuals, public records, books, and other publications. Things that have been uncovered by other people, or things that I've been able to ferret out myself, in order to tell a coherent story about a surname that goes back centuries but is largely unrecognized. In the end, I hope you'll know a whole lot more about who these people are, where they came from, how they acquired their various forms of the name, and where they are now. My curiosity about all this started early in life. When I was a kid, I would from time to time accompany my extended family to reunions in nearby Pennsylvania. Other Kiefhabers who lived in our neck of the woods didn't attend those gatherings. What I found odd was that our Pennsylvania relatives were all K-E Kiefhabers, while our neighbors, who apparently weren't even related to us, spelled their name exactly as we did. And there was this other thing. When I was in elementary school, the entire country became captivated by a series of U.S. Senate hearings exposing the American Mafia. For almost a year, everybody crowded around their televisions to follow the daily adventures of Tennessee's Senator Estes Kiefhaber, as he butted heads with notorious mobsters right there in our living rooms. The hearings made Senator Kiefhaber one of TV's earliest megastars and set him up for a couple of runs to the presidency. He never reached the White House, but he was nonetheless a very successful politician. People often ask me if Senator Kiefhaber was my uncle or cousin. Neither I nor anyone in my Kiefhaber family knew how to answer that question. Obviously, though, his name and ours were similar. So similar that even our neighbors sometimes called us by his last name. It eventually occurred to me that they were pronouncing the letter O in my last name as they would in words like job or rob or mob. And when I looked at it that way, well, yes, the senator and I probably were both Kiefhabers. Roughly 10 years ago, I discovered the impressive genealogical work of a second cousin named Scott Novak. He was someone I vaguely remembered from those old Kiefhaber reunions. Scott could trace our family tree back 9 generations to Frederick County, Maryland. And according to him, a pair of brothers were the first of our kind to show up in the American colonies. The younger of the two, Philip, became a farmer and miller in Middletown, Maryland, going by the name of Kiefhaber. Many of Philip's neighbors were French Huguenots, that is, they were Calvinist Protestants who'd emigrated from a place in Germany called the Palatinate. King Louis XIV had sent dragoon soldiers into their homes to torment them until they converted to Catholicism or left his country. Many fled next door to the German Palatinate, where the local count needed their services and could care less about their religious beliefs. However, the Palatinate was facing hard economic times, and the Huguenots, as well as many Germans, eventually left for British America. In the colonies, all German immigrants were just assumed to be of French Huguenot descent, and that's probably why Gladys Austin Kiefhaber, an amateur historian in Middletown, surmised that Philip's family name was an Americanized version of the French name Lefebvre or Lefebvre. However, Calvin Schildknecht, a professional historian, claimed that Philip was a German whose surname was in fact Kiefhaber back in the old country. Church archives from the Palatinate city of Speyer confirm the birth and baptism of Philip and brother Conrad in the nearby town of Schuersfeld. The brothers are believed to have immigrated to America in about 1742. They probably entered the port of Annapolis, Maryland, although that can't be confirmed due to the loss of passenger lists in a fire. Conrad eventually settled in York County, Pennsylvania, while Philip went on to western Maryland. Although Philip was a German, he was also a devout Calvinist who donated land for the construction of a church in Middletown under the auspices of the Reformed Church of America. His church was destroyed by a fire and then rebuilt nearby. Today, the church's graveyard is filled with tombstones of Philip's deceased family members. These are the grave markers for Philip's eldest son and daughter-in-law. What becomes obvious as you walk among the graves is that the Kiefhabers had lots of ways of spelling their family name. In fact, that's how it's always been with us. From our origins through the present, the name has appeared in multiple forms. As our ancestors became literate, they wrote the name phonetically, that is, they tried to spell it like it sounded. When others read it out loud, they sounded it out in their local dialect and therefore changed the sound of the name. Then in turn, someone else phonetically spelled it based on that pronunciation, and so on. Everything I've said so far is based on the efforts of cousin Scott Novak and others who've shared their knowledge in various internet forums. But with understanding of who my ancestors were in America, I became curious about who the Kiefhabers were and are in Germany. A now-defunct website created by Roland Kiefhaber in Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany, and American Paul Kiefhaber from Texas was my next resource. The fact that it no longer exists told me that somebody should be preserving this stuff. Following their clues, I scoured books, visited places, and otherwise tried to run down every lead I could find. Truthfully, I was kind of obsessive about it, and I realized that some of what follows may bore you to tears. The earliest preserved examples of this surname are to be found in and around the south-central German city of Augsburg. Located near the border between the states of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, the territory extending west from Augsburg to the Rhine River was once known as the Duchy of Swabia. Nuremberg is 90 miles to the north, and the Palatinate birthplace of Philip Kiefhaber is just over 200 miles to the northwest. Although neither Schiersfeld nor Nuremberg were ever part of Swabia, both are situated near what were its northern limits. To this day, virtually every instance of the family name in Germany is found within the boxed area shown here. Based on that alone, it's likely that our ancestors were Swabian and may have descended from Celts and/or the Alemanni Germanic tribe. Like the rest of southern Germany, the Kiefhaber neighborhood became part of the Roman Empire during the 1st century A.D. It was then that German families adopted the practice of using surnames based on their primary occupation or their role in the community. So you had your milling Müllers, the baking Beckers, and the farming Bauers. Etymologists claim that our surname was a combination of the German verb kiffen, which currently means to smoke dope, but originally meant to chew or munch, with the noun Haber, meaning oats. A 14th century song from Augsburg illustrates those meanings of the words when posing the question, Wilt kiffen Haberstroh? Do you want to munch oat straw? Admittedly, it's a bit humbling to find that Kiefhabers were oat munchers, peasants whose diets amounted to cattle feed. But this is where we begin to see how dialect accounts for all the later variations in the spelling and pronunciation of our name. You see, Haber, with a B, was indeed the word for oats, but only in the Old High German or Hochdeutsch dialect of southern Germany. In modern Hochdeutsch, now Standard German, and in the north, where Low German or Plattdeutsch was spoken, Hofer, with an F, means the same thing. Furthermore, the German practice of using V to make the English F sound first began in Middle Germany, in places like Rhineland-Palatinate. The English V sound, on the other hand, is represented by the letter W. So depending on time and place, Haber was the same as Hofer, and the word might be spelled as Haber, Hafer, Haver, and even Hawer. Obviously, when Haber was the second syllable of a name, the H often went silent. Try it yourself. Say Kiefhaber. Kiefhaber, Kiefhaber, Kiefhaber. Now consider all the ways you might try to write those sounds, and you can see how it all went down. There's a document buried deep in Augsburg city archives that was signed by Herr Heinrich Kiefhaber in 1397, and it was just 50 years after that, and 30 miles further south, that a building contractor named Ulrich Kiefhaber built a cathedral in the town of Landsberg am Lech. Even now, 600 years later, you'll find this sign identifying the street that was named in his honor. In both time and space, these two men existed in close proximity, and the spelling of their names was nearly identical. The evidence isn't entirely clear, but surely they were related. At first glance, we might assume that both of them pronounced their name as Kiefhaber. However, the German letter I is usually pronounced like an English long E, and sometimes so is the letter Y. What settles this matter is that not long after finishing the basilica in Landsberg am Lech, that humble old oatmuncher Ulrich popped up in Nuremberg, where he quickly amassed a fortune in the spice trade. As a big-shot Nuremberg patrician, Ulrich took to spelling his name as Kiefhaber. Well, Germans always pronounce the IE phoneme like an English long E, so we can confidently conclude that the name was intended to be pronounced as Kiefhaber or Kiefhaber in the north. At this point, it's pretty obvious that despite the tricks that phonetics has played on us, all of these surnames represent Kiefhabers, or Kiefhafers if you prefer. So, who are the Kiefhabers culturally and genetically? Based on the surname's historical dominant area of distribution, this southwestern corner of today's Germany is our ancestral neighborhood. The Chronicle of Human Migration in European Cultures indicates that it's been a real melting pot. We'll start from the beginning to see why that is. Of course, the human race arose in south-central Africa and started migrating to neighboring continents around 100,000 years ago. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers crossed above the Red Sea and into the Middle East, then spread to Asia and through Turkey's Anatolian Peninsula to reach Europe about 50,000 years ago. Ice Age glaciers confined them to lands between the Mediterranean Sea and south of the Alps and Carpathian Mountains, so few of them made it as far north as our neck of the woods. Roughly 70,000 years ago, humans found their way from East Africa across the mouth of the Red Sea and into southern Arabia. From there, they spread into India, the Orient, and north to the Fertile Crescent of Iraq and Persia. There they took up farming and established the world's earliest cities. Like the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, these Middle Eastern farmers migrated east into Asia and west through Anatolia to Europe. By then, the glaciers were melting, and these newer arrivals tended to move west across Europe along the Mediterranean coast or along the Danube River north of the mountains. Those following the Danube eventually reached the Atlantic Ocean and expanded up toward the North Sea or crossed to the British Isles. These people became the Celts. South of the mountains, a genetic mix of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Anatolian farmers gave rise to the Italic culture. Celts and Italics didn't get along well and evolved separately into the societies that defined Europe for several thousand years. In the meantime, some of the migrants who had gone east from the Fertile Crescent veered north into the Asian steppe lands. Known as the Yamnayas, these folks had 1. Managed to domesticate horses, 2. Included people who were genetically lactose tolerant, and 3. Some of them carried a genetic mutation that produced blue eyes, light skin, and reddish blonde hair. As they stormed into Europe on horseback, these milk-guzzling giants, some with ghostly pale skin, fair hair, and blue eyes, went about dramatically disrupting Celtic and Italic societies. The leading edge of Yamnayas entering Europe were hot-blooded young warriors. As they moved back and forth in and out of Celtic and Italic territories, they cast their seed and spread their language throughout the continent. In time, their Proto-Indo-European language, or PIE, became the basis for all European languages. In South and Central Europe, the Yamnaya intermingled extensively with Italics and Celts, Some, however, entered the sparsely populated territories of the north and gave rise to the Slavs and Nordic peoples. Other Yamnayas, now identified as the corded ware culture, followed rivers that led northwest from the Danube toward the Baltic Sea. There they overwhelmed the few Celts who had reached northern Europe and lower Scandinavia before them. Toward the end of the Iron Age, not long before the birth of Christ, Europe was inhabited by four dominant cultures. You had your highly civilized Italics in the south, the Druid-led Celts in west and central regions, the Slavs in the east, and an uncivilized bunch of blonde-haired, blue-eyed Yamnaya descendants scattered throughout the north around the Baltic Sea. The Celts and Italics were always fighting, but the Italics eventually coalesced into the mighty Roman Empire and subdued the Celts, who they called the Gauls, in 54 BC. Julius Caesar and his successors had dreams of expanding into the vast territory that stretched north from the Danube to the Baltic, between the Rhine in the west and the Elbe River in the east. Caesar called it Germania, and the name stuck. The descendants of Celts and Germani who were living in southern Germany, including our Kiefhaber homeland, became Roman subjects early on, but the Roman army bit off more than it could chew when they invaded the massive dark forest further north. They failed to appreciate that huge tribes of obstinate Germani were already migrating south to escape climate change, flooding, and overpopulation. Tribal confederations like the Franks, Cimbrians, Teutons, Suebi, and the Goths were searching for room to grow in some of those tasty Mediterranean wine grapes they'd heard about. Clashes between Romans and Germani began around the year 50 BC. Over the next 400 years, the Germans gradually wore down the Roman army until the Goths delivered the death blow in 476 AD. With no more Romans to fight, Germany became a collection of tribal territories and warring feudal kingdoms. Kiefhabers then found themselves subjects of the Frankish and Bavarian kingdoms, but most were probably living in the kingdom of Alemannia. The one thing those warlords had in common was the Christian faith. They'd learned it from the Romans and had an allegiance to the Pope in Rome. When Attila the Hun began conducting annual raids into Western Europe, it was the church that brought the kings together to defend against a common foe. That worked well and led to the formation of a new and holy Roman Empire, with its emperors being elected from among those feudal kings. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, was successful as the first elected emperor. His descendants were able to pass the crown from one generation to the next for over 150 years, but things slowly fell apart, and Saxon King Otto was brought in to right the ship. From then on, and for most of its existence, most emperors were Germans. There were still a few kingdoms in the new empire, but most of the tribal territories were designated as duchies and were independently ruled by dukes. A new type of aristocrat also came into existence, known as counts. They were often bishops, who were handpicked by the Pope because their vote counted when a new emperor was to be elected. Counts ruled palatines or palatinates, and the count who ruled the Rhineland Palatinate was so powerful that he eventually became the Count Palatine. Kiefhabers at that point were living in the Rhineland Palatinate and in the duchies of Bavaria or Swabia, most of them in the latter. The medieval duchies and palatines were essentially templates for what became modern-day German states. Bavaria is still Bavaria, and there's still a Rhineland Palatinate. But what was once Swabia is more or less the state of Baden-Württemberg. Early in the 2nd century, our Kiefhaber neighborhood began to flourish. When Emperor Otto's dynasty ran out of heirs, Charles II, the son of a Rhineland count from Speyer, ascended as Holy Roman Emperor. His son, Henry III, became the King of Bavaria and built a hunting estate on the Pignitz River. In order to minimize his business travel, he established his government at that castle, and that led to the founding of Nuremberg. After several generations, the lack of heirs in the Salian dynasty resulted in a transition of rule to the Hohenstaufens from nearby Swabia. Throughout these changes, Nuremberg continued to grow into an imperial favorite. It became a hub for arts and sciences and international trade. In 1970, Joseph Kiefhaber, a Pennsylvania schoolteacher, visited Nuremberg's archives and discovered the significant role Kiefhaber's played in the city's history. According to his findings, the Swabian church builder named Ulrich Kiefhaber, initially spelled Kiffhaber, amassed a fortune in Nuremberg's spice trade by 1465. From then until 1550, he and his sons served on the city council, held municipal administrative offices, were prominent in religious affairs, and generally mingled with the elite. Nuremberg, as a so-called free imperial city, was granted autonomy to mint its own currency and conduct its own wars. Therefore, councilmen, like our Kiefhabers, were a lot like senators and were known as Grossburgers or patricians. They were accountable only to the emperor. In fact, kings and dukes often borrowed money from these patricians. Unlike with inherited titles, patricians only gained noble status by acquiring rural land, but then they could adopt baron-like names such as von Kiefhaber or Kiefhaberhof. Now, that would explain, for instance, the surname of a highly decorated World War I general named von Kiefhaber. Does he bear a resemblance to any of your relatives? As nouveau aristocrats, patricians were entitled to their own family coat of arms, and Ulrich commissioned this one. Joseph Kiefhaber stated that this family crest could be found in a window at St. Lorenz Church in Nuremberg. But if it ever was, I can tell you it's no longer there. However, the director of Lutheran Art and Properties in Nuremberg once sent me a photo of a medieval family portrait featuring the Kiefhaber coat of arms, and which currently hangs in another old Nuremberg church. But the image shown here is a stained glass window at St. Jacob's Church in Nuremberg, now a Lutheran congregation, but originally built by the Roman Catholic Order of Teutonic Knights in 1209 during the Crusades. Post-Reformation, the Knights resisted the church being taken over by Lutherans, but they weren't allowed to hold Catholic services there and even had to employ a Protestant minister to serve their church. This particular pane does not match the surrounding window's themes, which depicts the tree of Jesse, so its presence in the window is a mystery. The church was damaged during World War II, and this pane might have served as a replacement for a destroyed section. Nonetheless, the church's art director has no information on its origin or purpose. The bird-beak helmet in the crest signifies that the coat of arms belongs to a patrician rather than a baron, and the small shield with back-to-back crows in the lower left corner represents the family crest of Ulrich's in-laws, another patrician family named the Krells. Now, look at that peculiar little man on the main shield. His red and white outfit with the pointy hat was not typical medieval attire in Nuremberg. And what about the sheaves of oats he's holding? Is that because Ulrich was, after all, an oat muncher? Well, maybe, but I'm suggesting another explanation, and the church archivist concedes that I might be onto something. Now, take a closer look at this picture, and notice the figures dressed like our little man running around on that boat. This image is from a handcrafted book sold as a souvenir to wealthy patrons. It portrays a recurring parade float from an annual event in Nuremberg known as the Schembartlauf, the running of the bearded masks, which was similar to Mardi Gras. The float, dubbed the Ship of Fools, was intended to satirize some notable local figure each year. Along its route, the parade was accompanied by masked runners in jester-like costumes carrying fireworks. These pranksters would mock the audience, hurl eggs at buildings, and wave their fireworks around, creating a substantial fire hazard in a city largely made of wood. Only bratty rich kids could get by with that, and that's precisely who they were. Running in this parade was a rite of passage for the town's elite young snobs. The Ship of Fools made its debut in the same year that Ulrich Kiefhaber joined the city council. His sons, Hans and Wolf, participated as runners in 1503. It's my belief that the Kiefhabers were especially proud of their involvement in the Schembartlauf, and they based their family crest on one of these runners. Does that seem far-fetched? Well, okay. Here's another young Nuremberger, a friend of the family named Albrecht Dürer, who proudly wore the attire of a runner in his self-portrait. Dürer was one of medieval Europe's most significant artists, a friend of Leonardo da Vinci no less, and his invaluable artworks are displayed in museums worldwide to this day. But we'll say more about him soon. The Schembartlauf was halted in 1525. Father Andreas Osiander, a Martin Luther follower, became the priest at St. Lawrence Church and led his congregation to embrace Protestantism. Since his followers included the city's upper class, he was able to persuade the city officials to ban the parade outright after being mocked by the Ship of Fools. The Schembartlauf didn't make a comeback in Nuremberg until 1974, and even now, it's held only sporadically. Now, what about Albrecht Dürer? Nuremberg was a sizable medieval city. Even at its peak, though, its population didn't exceed 25,000. Maybe as many as 1,500 affluent families ran in the same circles. For this and other reasons, there's little doubt that Dürer and the Kiefhabers were acquainted. As further evidence of this, one of Dürer's better-known works is this portrait of Ulrich's great-grandson, Hieronymus Holzschuer. He was the grandson of Dorothea Kiefhaber Munzer and her husband, Dr. Hieronymus Munzer. Munzer was a physician, a wealthy businessman, and eventually became an internationally recognized humanist and geographer. And then there's Oswald Krell. Remember, Ulrich Kiefhaber's in-laws were the Krells. As an indication of Oswald's standing in Nuremberg, Dürer painted depictions of the so-called wild man in the side panels of his portrait. Similar to the Ship of Fools, the wild man was a recurring feature in the Schembartlauf parade. Now, this leads us back to the Kiefhaber coat of arms. Who could have created such an unusual piece? Well, a Nuremberg artist named Nicholas Glockenden was renowned for painting family crests. He was also well known for creating illuminated manuscripts for very affluent clients. It could have been him. In fact, one of his works was the Kiefhaber family prayer book, which is now housed in the German National Museum. However, Glockenden was known to freely use the designs and drawings of Albrecht Dürer, and it raises a plausible question about whether Dürer might have had a role in creating the Kiefhaber coat of arms. Moreover, Dürer himself was involved in the coat of arms industry and crafted stained glass windows in his Nuremberg workshop. Considering all this, and Dürer's interest in Schembartlauf characters like the jester on the Kiefhaber crest, well, call me crazy, but I'm saying the Kiefhaber window pane is yet another Dürer masterpiece that has endured for over 500 years. Prove me wrong. The Kiefhabers continued to live the Nuremberg dream for at least another 120 years. However, the Reformation had triggered a series of events across Europe that struck the city and its patrician families like a tsunami. War erupted between Catholic countries in the south and Protestant kingdoms in the north, putting both Nuremberg and the Rhineland smack dab in the middle. The terrible conflict ground on for 30 years and devastated both of those Kiefhaber enclaves. Fortunes and hundreds of thousands of lives were wiped away. Apparently, though, the Nuremberg Kiefhabers continued to survive and prosper. For example, in as late as 1762, Johann Karl Sigmund Kiefhaber was born into a family of wealthy city officials and later became an honored diplomat and historian. In 1920, they even named a street after him in the Mugeldorf section of the city. It's not a long street, and it runs through what seems to be a neighborhood of unremarkable apartment buildings, but it does feature this sign. Despite Professor Kiefhaber's achievements in 18th century Nuremberg, the 30 Years' War had taken a heavy toll on the city, and it initiated a slow decline in commercial and artistic vitality. Manufacturing brought some recovery in the late 1800s, but the Spanish flu and World War I brought further setbacks in the early 20th century. Extremist left and right political forces then fed off widespread discontent and ushered in the Nazis by 1935. That made it a target for heavy Allied bombing during World War II. Over those 2 centuries of recurring chaos, Kiefhaber's gradually slipped out of Nuremberg. In 1970, Pennsylvania schoolteacher Joseph Kiefhaber discovered that just one elderly woman with that surname appeared on a list of the city's residents. So where did they all get to? They'd enjoyed social prominence for over a century and undoubtedly had political connections that could be exploited as fortunes fell. But did they immigrate to Bohemia or Moravia in the modern-day Czech Republic? Or did they rejoin the Kiefhabers living further south in Bavaria and Swabia, or even out in the wild west of the Rhineland? The surname Kiefhaber is occasionally found in the Czech Republic and in Austria. Any relationship between those with that name and the German Kiefhabers, let alone the Nuremberg Kiefhabers, is unclear. Although there are claims that Kiefhaber is distinct from Kiefhaber, I once ran across a website originating in Moravia whose authors seem to think that Kiefhaber is just another spelling variation of Kiefhaber. Things are more straightforward in Germany, possibly because of a concerted mid-19th century effort to standardize the German language. The Kiefhaber spelling is almost uniformly used. For whatever reason, there was at one time a disproportionate number of German Kiefhabers living in southern Rhineland-Palatinate. Even after Philip and Conrad Kiefhaber departed for America in the 1740s, by 1800 there was hardly a town in the region without at least one Kiefhaber family. The website, once maintained by Roland and Paul Kiefhaber, 1F and 2 respectively, called the place a Kiefhaber incubator. But with Philip and Conrad sending back word that things were great in the American colonies, the incubator ran out of Kiefhabers over the next 50 years. Some had moved south to larger towns like Kaiserslautern, Speyer, and Karlsruhe, but many followed Philip and Conrad's lead and sailed to America. Unlike the 2 brothers, they landed in New York, spread west through New York and Pennsylvania to Ohio, and thereby avoided the Americanized Kiefhaber misspelling of the name. But why the great exodus from the Palatinate? Well, I've been there, and as a born and bred Appalachian American, I appreciate its country charm and rural beauty, but the Rhineland was a hot mess during the 18th century. The 30 Years' War had reduced its population by as much as 70%, so that the French Huguenots were actually doing Count Palatine a favor by fleeing up from the French Alsace-Lorraine to his Palatinate. They were educated, skilled, and famously industrious, and could therefore generate taxable income. But even before they got there, the Count had already recruited some displaced Dutch, Swiss, and Germans from other war-torn areas, so that the Palatinate became quite the cultural melting pot. The one thing his new subjects had in common was their Calvinist Protestant religious leanings. In the 1970s, American schoolteacher Joseph Kiefhaber and his father Horace argued that the Rhineland Kiefhabers were descendants of the Nuremberg branch of the family. I don't know how that can be proven, but it's certainly plausible, and here's why. The first Palatinate Kiefhaber I can document was Hans Heinrich Kiefhaber. Born in 1626, he would have been 22 years old when the 30 Years' War ended. However, and whenever he arrived, he ultimately became the Schultheiss of Schiersfeld. It's something like a combination mayor and county sheriff, and it wasn't an elected office. He would have had to have been appointed by the Count Palatine himself to keep the peace and collect the taxes. It was several rungs down the social ladder from being a Nuremberg patrician, but times were hard back in the big city, and the job would have allowed him to at least preserve a little aristocratic dignity. In tracing birth records, it looks as though Schultheiss Hans was the great-grandfather of American immigrants Philip and Conrad. The Germans, Huguenots, and others trying to make a go of it in the Palatinate were fighting an impossible obstacle. King Louis XIV came after their land and drew them into a 9-year war with the rest of Europe. That was followed by famine, and then Napoleon slashed and burned his way through as he headed for Munich. Is it any wonder that Huguenot or not, any place on earth offered better chances for a peaceful life than the German Palatine? At the age of 16, Philip became old enough to accompany older brother Conrad on a voyage to America. They probably embarked in Rotterdam, Holland, expecting to arrive 6 weeks later in New York or Philadelphia. Today, it's mind-boggling to think that a pair of teenagers would undertake a journey like that on their own. Immigrant ships were insufferable and a menace to life and limb. Crammed together without regard for age, sex, or state of health, passengers endured inadequate ventilation, rancid water, and poor general sanitation. Crew members were abusive, and sickness sometimes led to dehydration and death. Clearly, the people coming to America were incredibly tough and resilient. The exact year of Conrad and Philip's arrival in the colonies is unknown. Most Palatine immigrants sailed into Philadelphia or New York, but some were unexpectedly dropped off in Baltimore or Annapolis, Maryland. That was especially common during the early 1740s and resulted in poor record-keeping that, when combined with a fire in the port of Annapolis, now makes it impossible to find details about these folks. Irish immigrants could readily indenture themselves to pay off the cost of their journey and gain a financial foothold in America. But work opportunities were scarce for Germans who didn't speak English. Their best option was to travel inland where German communities had already gathered. Conrad and Philip made their way to York County in southeastern Pennsylvania, where German-speaking Amish and Mennonite religious sects had settled 20 years earlier. In their so-called Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, the word for oats is spelled as H-A-W-E-R or H-A-V-E-R and spoken as haver. However, the ah sound can also be spelled as a double A or AU. In all probability, that's where the Kiefhaber surname began taking on forms like Kiefhaber, Kiefhaber, or Kiefhofer. Conrad settled in Hanover, married Anna Margaretha Brown, and fathered 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Whether or not he ever used the surname Kiefhaber after coming to America, he and his offspring were referred to as Kiefhavers or Kiefhofers. Based on that spelling of the name, his descendants appear to have spread west across Pennsylvania and into Ohio and Tennessee. Philip initially took up residence in nearby Littlestown. However, before the Mason-Dixon line was surveyed, that area was known as Penmar, owing to the fact that both Pennsylvania and Maryland levied taxes there. Philip therefore moved on to Smithtown, later renamed Middletown, in Frederick County, Maryland. Newly arriving immigrants from the Palatinate typically just passed through rural inland Maryland on their way from German settlements in New York and Virginia. It wasn't until Lord Baltimore started offering cheap land that they gave any thought to actually living there. The gesture was well received, though, and he soon populated those wide-open spaces with honest, industrious people who thought they'd died and gone to heaven. As quickly as they built a house and planted a crop, they would construct a community church. As is true even now in Germany, those early churches were evangelical in the sense that they served both Lutheran and Calvinist congregations. Ironically, Lord Calvert of Baltimore was a Roman Catholic who had intended his Maryland Commonwealth to be a refuge of religious tolerance, especially for those of his own faith. While the Germans who settled in Maryland came to be known as Calverts, the term more often than not was taken to mean the Protestant Calvinists. By 1746, Philip had married Heidelberg immigrant Anna Maria Beckenbaugh, purchased 5 acres of land, and started a grist mill. 2 years later, he purchased another 567 acres of farmland and donated 50 acres of that land for a church. He and Anna Maria proceeded to raise 6 children, 2 daughters and 4 sons. His eldest daughter died 1 year before he and his wife passed away in 1779. Around Frederick County, Philip and his descendants are to this day mostly known as Kiefhavers, but things didn't start out that way. Philip became a naturalized British citizen in 1760 using the name Kiefhaber. 2 decades later, his will referred to him and his children as Kiefhabers, with double E's in the first syllable and an O replacing the second syllable A. That's what later led some to spell the name as my family does, Keefover, and pronounce it as Kiefhaber. For 30 years after his death, baptismal records from the Reformed Church of Middletown listed Philip's descendants as Kiefhabers, with the IEF or IEFF spelling. The Kiefhaber spelling, Keefauver, did not show up in those records until his great-grandson Julian was baptized a full 30 years after Philip first got to Middletown. As it turns out, Philip became a British citizen just 16 years before the United States declared independence from Britain. He died midway through the Revolutionary War as one of this country's first citizens. Even though his community was located on the edge of the wilderness, they couldn't escape the war. Second son Nicholas, for instance, served in the Continental Army. Beyond that, though, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had the foresight to establish a prisoner of war camp nearby, specifically to hold captured Hessian soldiers. While the British sometimes executed captured Continental Army soldiers as traitors to the crown, Washington believed that his captives were due the dignity of brothers in arms. Furthermore, by housing their German POWs near communities that spoke their language, prisoners could earn their keep on local farms. It reduced maintenance costs and prepared them for U.S. citizenship when their own rulers neglected to bring them home at war's end. I found at least one Kiefhaber listed among Hessian soldiers who'd been sent to America, so it's possible that a few American Kiefhabers are descendants of enemy combatants. But it's not for me to spill the beans if and if I knew who they were. When Philip died, his youngest child, Peter, was 18 years old. Philip's properties were divided among his 4 sons, with Nicholas and Peter inheriting the family gristmill. Eldest son, Philip, and second son, Nicholas, continued to prosper in Frederick County, while third and fourth sons, Jacob and Peter, eventually relocated to Fayette County, Pennsylvania, and Roanoke, Virginia. Jacob also inherited financial responsibilities for his surviving sister, so she accompanied him to southwestern Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Jacob's family used the single E Kiefhaber spelling of the name, but his second son, George, later took up residence 60 miles south in Monongalia County, Virginia, now West Virginia, and recorded his last name as K-E-E Kiefhaber. Along with several of his offspring, he later set out for Kansas, leaving second son John in Monongalia County and grandson David in nearby Preston County. Grandson William R. originally accompanied the family to Kansas, but later brought his own family back to Taylor County, West Virginia. About 70 years after George left for Kansas, his older brother Philip's great-grandson Lyman, or Nick, moved to nearby Marion County, West Virginia. As a Fayette County, Pennsylvania Kiefhaber, Nick spelled his last name with a single E. However, businesses, the government, and the education system in northern West Virginia already knew his name as Kiefhaber with double E's, and so Nick's family just went with that. That explains my childhood observation that there were people living around us who spelled their surname as we did, but who didn't attend our family reunions in Pennsylvania. Our neighbors were the original K-E-E Kiefhabers, a branch of our Fayette County, Pennsylvania line, who became the first to adopt our distinctive West Virginia Mountaineer double E. It's interesting to me that American Kiefhabers can approximate when and where their own spelling variation originated. If yours is the original German spelling, your forefathers arrived from the Palatinate in the 19th century and moved through New York to Ohio. Although unlikely, it's also possible that your forefather was a Hessian soldier without the means or a reason to return to Germany. Now, if you're a Kiefhaber, first-generation American Jacob of Middletown and then Fayette County, Pennsylvania, is probably your first namesake forefather. And if you're a double E Kiefhaber, your roots run through northern West Virginia and Kansas as a descendant of Jacob's second son, George. That is, unless you're one of us double E Kiefhabers who didn't arrive in West Virginia until the 20th century. We're more recently tied to the single E Kiefhabers of Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Finally, if you're a Kiefhaber, and the first syllable of your name uses double E or EA, immigrant brother Conrad of York County, Pennsylvania is probably your forefather. But if you're a single E Kiefhaber, you're almost certainly one of Conrad's Maryland nephews. That's to say that one of his immigrant brother Philip's sons, Philip, Nicholas, or Peter, is your forefather. If your Kiefhaber line runs through youngest brother Peter, it also passes through Roanoke, Virginia. 5 years after brother Jacob went to Fayette County, Pennsylvania, Peter set off down the Shenandoah Valley for Botetourt County, Virginia. Shortly thereafter, a section of the county was portioned off as Roanoke County, and the new Shenandoah Valley Railroad brought prosperity to town. The Kiefhabers became involved in manufacturing, real estate, and civic functions, so that the name is now peppered around the community on streets, cemeteries, and housing estates. In fact, the Roanoke City Municipal Building stands on land that was originally owned by Kiefhabers. Kiefhabers, however they've spoken or written the name, have for centuries generally lived their lives out of the limelight. From southern Germany to eastern America and beyond, they've been farmers and miners, teachers and preachers, doctors and lawyers, the kind of folks who've treaded softly in the background while trying to make their communities good places to be. Only rarely has someone like Nuremberg's Ulrich Kiefhaber been a big shot, the talk of the town. And none of us has garnered attention like the Honorable Carrie Estes Kiefhaber, two-time U.S. presidential candidate and long-serving senator from the state of Tennessee. Cousin Estes was the grandson of Reverend Jacob Peter Kiefhaber, a respected Baptist minister and grandson of first American generation Peter Kiefhaber of Middletown, Maryland, and Roanoke, Virginia. These days, he's only a footnote in American history, but in the mid-20th century, man, was Estes something. The kind of politician we'd like them all to be. Chairing Senate committees, panels, and hearings one after another, he ended price fixing by monopolistic automakers, brought about regulation of shady marketing practices by giant pharmaceutical companies, exposed pornographers and the effects of TV violence on juvenile delinquency, and was one of only 3 Southern senators to force implementation of comprehensive civil rights reform. But what really made him a household name was his year-long investigation of the American Mafia, much of it conducted right before our very eyes on nationwide TV. Televisions had only recently become widely available, and programming wasn't all that exciting. But when he started grilling unsavory characters like Frank Costello and Joey Adonis, getting them to squeal on other mobsters like Vito Genovese and Albert Anastasia, it was like binge-watching the entire Godfather movie series. In fact, many believe his hearings were the reason why those movies were so successful decades later. At times, 3 out of every 4 TV sets in the country were tuned in to Estes Kiefhaber doing his thing. But as we all know, sometimes you can be too good for your own good. He made a bitter enemy of Democrat President Harry Truman when his Organized Crime Committee honed in on mobsters influencing politics in Truman's own backyard. Then the very Tennessee Democrats who put him in office started calling him a sneaky pet coon and accused him of being a commie pinko because he supported civil rights legislation. He swatted down those distractors by donning a coonskin hat for the media and mocking them right back. Twice, he came within striking distance of being elected president, but despite his popularity among voters, the power brokers of his own party sabotaged his campaigns. Looking back, I sure wish I had known all this stuff when I was a kid. Estes was a superstar, even a hero, back in the day. Just think of all the tall tales I could have told at show and tell about the nifty baseball he sent me on my birthday or the fancy dinner we had at his place last weekend. Whether they knew I was lying or not, my buddies, maybe even the teacher, would have been impressed, knowing that just like Estes, I really am a Kiefhaber. And if I'd known that those other Kiefhabers in town were relatives, maybe I could have gotten a good price on an air conditioning system from Cousin Archie in Bellevue, or a great deal from Cousin Bill at the Ford dealership. It's too late for all that now, but at least I have a pretty good handle on where all us Kiefhabers fit in the overall scheme of things. After spending this almost an hour with me, I hope you feel the same way. By the way, I'm sure there is lots more to know about us, so if you've got something to add or correct, please get in touch at the email address that appears after the credits roll. For now, auf Wiedersehen, cousin.